Okay, welcome. My name is Luke Killian, and this is going to be a portion of my presentation called Viewing Fatness Through a Social Justice Lens. I'm only going to be presenting on about 15 to 20 minutes of it, and this will be the penultimate section of the presentation. So let me just start with some housekeeping and disclaimers. So for this presentation, I do want to give a warning that I'll be discussing fat shame, fat discrimination, and social stratification in detail. So it could be traumatic or re-traumatizing, particularly for fat people or people in recovery from an eating disorder. So if that's not something that is going to work for you today, feel free to turn this off now. As for me, I first began studying size discrimination about 9 years ago. It's a passion area of mine, but it's not something I have worked with in any sort of official capacity. I am a thin or straight-sized person, so I don't personally have the experience of fat stigma or size discrimination. My interest in body justice was informed by two personal experiences of mine, one as a transgender man and someone who's struggled with a bad relationship to eating before. So through my lens as a transgender person, I've heard a lot of arguments about my body not being natural, which I think can also relate to the ways we talk about fatness, but I do want to acknowledge that these are not the same. And finally, I do want to make a note on language. I will use the term fat. That can still carry a lot of shame for some people. I use it because a lot of people in the fat liberation community are intending to normalize its use. As just a neutral descriptor, I will avoid euphemisms like curvy or big boned because they can be offensive, and I think me not directly using the word fat communicates some shame about it inherently. So let me go ahead and exit this so I can skip to the section that I'll be covering today. So today I'm going to be going over anti-fat discrimination specifically. So just to start, I want to talk about differences in body size. The discrimination experienced by a fat person is not going to be the same depending on their size. I understand this is a little bit cut off with my screen recorder. I apologize, but this is from the Fat Lip podcast and fatlip.com. The person who runs it is named Ash. So she created this system just to differentiate how discrimination differs between a person's size. This is designed to provide language to describe those differences in experience and oppression. It's not designed to be fixed, immutable categories. So to put simply, the oppression experienced by someone who's a size 12 is not the same as someone who's a size 32. Okay, so here are some examples of microaggressions for people who are fat. One would be diet talk, talking negatively about your own body fat or your own weight gain, congratulating the weight loss of others without any initiation from them. I think a more current example of this would be when Adele posted images of herself after significant weight loss, and a lot of people were congratulating her on the internet about it, but she did not make a statement about her weight loss. I don't know if she's made one since then, but when she posted it, she did not indicate whether this was something she wanted. There's a lots of reasons that a person could lose a lot of weight. Mental health could be one of them. Shock that a fat person is not trying to lose weight. Unsolicited advice about how to lose weight. Unsolicited words of encouragement given to fat people exercising. It's fairly common for thin or straight-sized people to yell out at fat people while exercising, "Good job, keep going," which is assuming that the goal is to be thin and that that's better, and assuming that the reason the fat person is exercising is trying to change their body size. And finally, not allowing people to self-identify as fat. Phrases such as, "You're not fat, you're beautiful," "You're not fat, don't say that about yourself." And here are some more microaggressions. One would be shock that a fat person is ambitious or intelligent. So an example I have of this is a friend of mine who's a person of size was one of the, not the valedictorian, but had one of the highest GPAs of anyone in the high school. They did not have the specialized honors gowns for plus size people. The school did not keep them on hand. Another example would be rushing to fix fat people's clothes to hide their bodies. Like if someone's shirt rides up, although people will do that with thin people, there is an extra level of panic that is usually applied to covering up a fat person. Surprise that a fat person, particularly fat women, have a partner or a sex life, assuming that the partners of fat people are with them in spite of their appearance. Or, even worse, ascribing malicious intent to the partners of fat people. So assuming that the person who's with a fat person is either has a fetish, they're just in it for the money, or they're an abuser. I do want to note that in our society and culture, we do have a lot of accommodations for smaller bodies. We just don't think of them that way. So the fact that we have chair cushions is more useful for someone who doesn't have a lot of fat on their rear end. There are bumper cushions for sex for small people who have sex with each other. There's a picture of an example there. Our clothing is shaped for and sized for smaller bodies, which I'll get to in a second. Medical equipment is sized for smaller bodies, and I'll also get to examples of that. Public seating in facilities, body pillows to pad between people's knees when thin people sleep on their sides. So we celebrate thinness as normal and default, as if the fact that thin bodies don't need accommodations or specialized products mean that our bodies are inherently healthier. But it's not that accommodations aren't needed for thin bodies, it's that we've built our entire world to be sized for smaller people. Okay, so let's talk about structural discrimination for fat people, and this will get to some of the points that I had in the last slide. Theater seating not fitting fat people. Airplane seating not being correctly sized. Blood pressure bands. And mammogram machines of the wrong size. I want to touch on those two things really quick. So expert consensus varies on how to measure a very fat patient's blood pressure when the armband is too small, because standard sized blood pressure bands don't work for very fat patients. So even with a larger armband size, the shape of the arms on very fat people means that those standardized shapes don't work well. So like for a smaller person, the arm is a fairly consistent diameter from top to bottom, and that's what blood pressure bands are designed to work for. For someone who is much fatter, the arm has more of a conical shape, and again, the equipment we have is not designed to work for people whose bodies are shaped that way. And using a standard cuff on an obese patient makes their blood pressure measurements significantly higher. Mammogram machines that accommodate larger bodies, they're often not available in doctors' offices, so fat people who need to use a specialized mammogram machine, MRI machine, CT machine, are going to have to drive to the nearest hospital, most likely to be able to get medical care. Continuing on here, of course you can see the slide as well. Narrow bathroom stalls, some cars, turnstiles like in the subway, desks that connect, which is the picture I have here. Of course, these don't work for other groups as well, not just fat people. So for example, people who are pregnant. Chairs with arms, weak furniture, and then the fact that in all of our public restrooms, the option is toilet paper. We don't have other alternatives that are more accessible, such as bidets. Okay, so on clothing, I'm going to get to what I was saying earlier about how clothes are shaped for thin bodies. So the clothing for fat people, it's the same shape as the clothing for thin people, they just size it up, meaning that clothes are not shaped with large bodies in mind, which means they don't tend to fit as well as their smaller counterparts. of course, beyond a certain size, the options become very limited and more like a curtain or a muumuu shape. Finding activewear is very hard, especially for sizes 3X and above, which is ironic because of our culture's pressure on fat people to exercise and the assumption that that causes weight loss, right? So if fat people wear exercise or activewear, there's this idea of nobody wants to see that, that's too revealing, it's inappropriate, and they're also not generally shaped correctly to work well. And also models for plus size stores are often small. In terms of this being an accommodation or structural issue, I want to pause on that for 1 second. So there was an article I found written by a woman who had had a panniculectomy, which is a procedure where if you have a very fat lower belly or a hanging belly, they will cut your abdomen or lower abdomen off and then stitch the skin back together. So this is quite a step beyond liposuction, for example, because liposuction is not effective for people who are very fat. So she had this procedure, and I was looking through her reasoning of why she had it done. Most of her reasoning was that she hated that part of her body, but she did give one medical reason, which was that she was getting infections underneath her belly where the skin met the rest of her body. So the way she conceived of that, and how most people conceive of that, is that that indicates there's something pathological about her body fat. And there wasn't any acknowledgement of the fact that she could not buy affordable, properly fitting, moisture-wicking underwear. Which, I know it sounds kind of silly for me to talk about underwear, but this is really important in that underwear we have on the market, it's mostly cotton, which is notoriously bad at wicking moisture. And again, it's the same shape that you would see on a thin person. So when you just take that shape and expand it to a larger size, that means that it's not shaped correctly, so the fabric is not going to actually cover if someone has a very fat lower belly, and it's not going to meet the person at their body like where their legs meet, so they're not getting moisture wicking fabric where it needs to be. So I think that just goes to show that we tend to frame fatness as we medicalize it, we pathologize it, and we don't ask, okay, what social, structural lack of accommodation is there that is part of what's going on here, or what is, what we might say is like the medical problem that we're blaming on someone's size. Okay, so we've talked about microaggressions, structural discrimination. I want to get into anti-fat bias that is just bold, full out, blatant. So these different incidences of bias tend to hinge on some assumptions that our culture has about fat people. You might be assigning stereotypes that a fat person is lazy, incompetent, slobby, or unhygienic. And there's also, on the flip side of the coin, characterizing fat people as either happy, gentle, simple-minded, they're funny, they're always a joke, unambitious. So to that point, fat jokes is a really clear example of blatant anti-fat bias. Anti-fat hiring practices, which I'll get to in a second. Refusing to date a fat person, especially openly. A lack of respectful representation of fat people in either media or historical accounts. Denial of health care because health insurance may deem a fat person too risky. Even if a fat person does get health care, there is usually higher premiums attached to that. Denial of a right to adopt, so sometimes someone who is very fat will be deemed unfit to parent because of their size is presumed to say something about them. Rejection from organizations, or events because of, quote, not looking the part. The examples I've seen of this would be fat female college students being rejected from a sorority, not being told why, but then when they compare notes with each other, they realize, oh, all of us that were kicked out are either fat or of color or both. Another example I've heard of is with weddings. You're going to take a picture of the bride and groom with all of the bridesmaids, and the groomsmen, I think is what they're called. I don't know much about weddings. And if there are any bridesmaids or groomsmen who are